This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Kelly Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. South Korean President Lee Jae Myung hails citizens for overcoming chaos and turmoil as the country marks the first anniversary of its very brief martial law period. The French leader makes a fourth Beijing visit as Europe juggles security fears with economic dependence, even as the EU rolls out plans to curb reliance on Chinese rare earths. Hong Kong's typo inferno sparks fury and calls for a tougher probe and accountability. One unaffected block reopened briefly so residents could grab essential items. And Taipei accuses China of shadowing and simulating attacks on foreign naval warships in the Taiwan Strait to demonstrate Beijing's claims over the major trade route that both the US and Taiwan say is part of international waters. Also, a soaring debut for China national uranium on the Shenzhen Stock Exchange. The mineral is a cornerstone of President Xi Jinping's security strategy for the nation. This city has long been known as one of the happiest in China. Find out why Chengdu has consistently made the list for 16 straight years. South Korea marks 1 year today since ousted former leader Yoon Suk Yeol's failed martial law decree plunged the country into a months-long political crisis. South Korean leader Lee Jae Myung says that his country has overcome chaos and turmoil after months of protests, multiple arrests, court hearings, and a presidential election.
대한민국이 존재하는 한 헌정 질서와 민주주의를 지켜낸 것을 함께 기념하고 더 굳건한 민주주의를 다짐하는 계기로 삼겠습니다.
President Lee said that the past year is proof of South Korea's democratic resilience, but he admits more work remains to address the fallout of the attempted martial law, with strict punishment for its perpetrators only the beginning. Separately, dozens of lawmakers from the opposition People Power Party, of which Yoon was a member of, issued an apology for the martial law declaration. It's believed to be the first such acknowledgement, even though it's not fully supported by the entire party.
자유민주주의 체제가 위협받는 현실을 타개할 필요가 있었음을 이해하고 있습니다. 그러나 이는 어디까지나 헌법과 법률의 틀 내에서 정치를 통해 해결해야 할 문제였지 군대와 경찰을 동원한 비상계엄이라는 극단적인 방식으로 해결해서는 결코 안 될 일이었습니다.
Well, CNA senior correspondent Lim Yoon Suk joins us live from Seoul. Yoon Suk, I believe you are at a rally marking the martial law anniversary. Tell us, how deep is the political divide in the country 1 year on?
Yes, I am. I am outside the National Assembly here, where thousands of South Koreans have gathered to commemorate that day, the day when South Korea's former President Yoon Suk Yeol declared martial law here in South Korea. Now, this is exactly where thousands of South Koreans had gathered that night 1 year ago to allow South Korean lawmakers to enter the National Assembly and to take that vote to strike down the martial law order. Now, these South Koreans say they're gathered here again because they say it is very important that South Koreans don't forget what happened that day, and they believe that all those responsible have to be punished so that there's no other future persons here in South Korea who would even think about declaring martial law here in South Korea again. Now, earlier, President Lee Jae Myung held a press conference with the foreign media where he laid out, and he described this K-democracy here in South Korea, saying that he felt that it was a unique thing in South Korea for tens of thousands of South Koreans to be able to gather together, to be able to say what they want to, and yet there are no casualties and no violence and no rioting. And he says that he thinks that this is unique in South Korea and something that only South Korea. Let me share with you a report that I did to show you exactly what happened here in South Korea 1 year ago.
지금 대한민국은 당장 무너져도 이상하지
On December 3rd, 2024, then President Yoon Suk Yeol made a late-night announcement that shocked South Korea.
저는 북한 공산 세력의 위협으로부터 자유 대한민국을 수호하고 우리 국민의 자유와 행복을 약탈하고 있는 파렴치한 종북 반국가 세력들을 일거에 척결하고 자유 헌정 질서를 지키기 위해 비상계엄을 선포합니다.
South Koreans rushed to the National Assembly in a bid to stop the martial law order. Then Yoon was losing his grip on power following prolonged political wrangling with the opposition-controlled parliament, which he labeled anti-state. First-time lawmaker Seo Mi-hwa, who is visually impaired, arrived to find that police had formed a blockade, preventing anyone from entering. So she climbed the gates.
총 동글동글 이렇게 쇠문으로 돼 있는데 그 사다리처럼 연결돼가지고 동글동글하게 쭉쭉 연결돼 있더라고요. 이렇게 쭉쭉 만드는 거예요. 그럼 이게 발을 끼면 올라갈 수 있다는 뜻이잖아요. 그래서 제가 발을 하나씩 끼워서 이제 올라갔죠.
Hundreds of citizens such as Oh Kyun-bin also turned up.
시민분들이 계엄철폐 독재 타도를 계속 외치고 계셨고 실시간으로 이제 스마트폰으로 안에 상황 중계해주는 그 뉴스들을 이제 보면서 계속 이제 계엄 해제를 기다리고 있었죠.
190 lawmakers, mostly from the then opposition Democratic Party, with support from a few ruling party members who had managed to force their way in, voted unanimously to overturn martial law. The order lasted just 6 hours. But protests continued until the Constitutional Court upheld Yoon's impeachment in April, ousting him from the presidential office. The martial law crisis led to months of political vacuum before power shifted into the hands of the Democratic Party with the election of Lee Jae Myung as president in June. South Korea's international standing also took a hit, and its economy was left reeling, with GDP contracting 0.2% in the first quarter, as U.S. tariffs further worsened its outlook. But some analysts say the biggest worry is the deep-rooted political polarization building up to the martial law bid.
Everybody was shocked. Recovery speed is really high. Unless we address the potential source of effective polarizations, I don't think, the Korean democracy is going to be healthier.
Professor Park says the crisis, which ended without bloodshed, also showed the resilience of the nation's transition to democracy.
They were not only afraid by the passive action by military forces, but also, more importantly, they were afraid of large mobilization of the public.
1 year on, former President Yoon is standing trial on charges of insurrection and abuse of power. If convicted, he could be jailed for life or even be sentenced to death. South Koreans say it is crucial that he be held accountable to ensure that no future president will ever dare to declare martial law again in this country. Now, President Yi has said that he was going to designate December 3rd as a People's Sovereignty Day, as it showed the will and the power of the South Korean people.
Well, Yoon Suk, meantime, North Korea, well, that remains among the key polarizing issues. What do you think the president's approach to relations with Pyongyang is going to be?
Well, President Lee Jae Myung also discussed North Korea during that press conference, and there was a question asked by one reporter whether he thought that there should be an apology to North Korea on the state level, and he did say yes, he thought that it was the right thing to do to be apologizing to North Korea, because he was talking about the time when former President Yoon Suk Yeol declared the martial law. He had used North Korea as an excuse to do so, and so President Lee Jae Myung felt that it was needed to apologize to North Korea, though he hasn't said so, because he said that he wasn't sure whether he and his administration would be labeled as pro-North Korea if he did that. But it is something that he's considering, and also he has said that despite despite the goodwill gestures that South Korea has put out there, like taking down all the loudspeakers along the borders, he said that there's been no response from North Korea. It's very difficult to get a response from North Korea. But one thing very interesting that did come up at the press conference was there was a question by a reporter about what he was going to do about the 6 South Koreans who were detained in North Korea right now. And he was baffled to that question, saying he wasn't aware that there were South Koreans being detained in North Korea. And then he turned that question to his national security advisor, Lee Sung-nak. And so that really shocked most of the reporters in that room, because even his unification ministry had earlier said that North Korea had to release those South Korean detainees. And so it'll be interesting to see whether South Korean President Lee Jae Myung, who really wants to sit down with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, has any plans to do something about bringing his citizens back to South Korea, and whether, because this is something that will definitely strain relations between South and North Korea. So that's something that we'll be watching about. But President Lee Jae Myung is eager to try and get North Korea out to the negotiating table. So we'll see what plans he has in the coming months.
All right, for now, I'm going to leave you to the rest of the rally, which has quite a party or festive atmosphere, I have to say. Thanks so very much, CNA senior correspondent Lim Yoon Suk in Seoul. And of course, we're going to keep the conversation going into the political polarization in South Korea. In fact, I'll be speaking with Ramon Pacheco Pardo, a professor of international relations at King's College London, a little later this hour. French President Emmanuel Macron has arrived in Beijing for a 3-day state visit. He will meet Chinese President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Qiang at the Great Hall of the People tomorrow. The French leader's trip comes as Europe seeks to balance ties with China on the economic and security front. Back in the EU, the bloc has just released plans aimed at ending its reliance on Chinese rare earths. And we've got our correspondents joining us live now for more. CNA's Tan Soo-hui in Beijing and Ross Cullen covering this story for CNA in Paris. Ross, first to you. Walk us through what are some of the key issues on the agenda for Mr. Macron?
Hi, Italy. Well, Emmanuel Macron touched down in China about 30 minutes or so ago on the tarmac, accompanied by his wife, Brigitte Macron, who was wearing a red coat, perhaps a reference there to China's, the colour on the national flag. Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, was waiting on the tarmac to greet the French president and his wife. And then tomorrow will be the first major day of events. For Emmanuel Macron, he does want to try to push China to consume more and export less, was one of the messages, despite the fact that China's exports to the European Union have been surging over the last couple of years. There will also be discussions, notably about the war in Ukraine. There could be an attempt by Emmanuel Macron to try to encourage Xi Jinping to apply pressure on Vladimir Putin to end the conflict after the latest round of talks, which concluded yesterday between President Putin and Steve Witkoff, the US Special Envoy. There was no immediate breakthrough. European powers are meeting today under the auspices of the NATO foreign ministers umbrella in Brussels, and so there will be the war in Ukraine on the agenda. Telecoms as well. Germany very nervous about China's influence in the 5G and 6G networks, where we see France also try to double down on Chinese influence in Europe's telecoms market. But of course, there will also be a chance to try to, quote, deepen the cooperation, according to the Elysee Palace, when it comes to the economy, commerce, culture and trade.
Soo-hui, and of course, Mr. Macron is no stranger to China. He's been there. This is his 4th trip. But how do you think China will likely receive the French president this time compared to his previous trips?
Well, there's likely going to be consistent high-level hospitality for Mr. Macron as Beijing views France as a strategic partner. So the French president will be visiting an extra city, which is Chengdu this time around. And this is just the same as his previous visits where Guangzhou as well as Shanghai were the extra legs. Now, this is beyond just a symbolic gesture. It shows that diplomatic and economic agenda are on the table. Beijing hopes to be seen as a business partner for France, and he also hopes that France will help to strengthen China and European Union relations. Despite trade tensions at the moment, they're also hoping that this would not be a repeat of the tense meeting when EU leader Ms. Ursula von der Leyen, she had visited Beijing earlier in July, and back then she had said that China and EU are at an inflection point in terms of their relations. Back then, Chinese President Mr. Xi Jinping had mentioned that the problems that EU faces does not come from China. China is also likely going to reiterate the One China policy amid the diplomatic row between China and Japan over the Taiwan question. And this comes as Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, she had mentioned that this could trigger a military response from Tokyo if there is an attack on Taiwan. And just last week, we had seen the top diplomats from both China and France. They had talked about this issue. Mr. Wang Yi once again reiterating the One China policy. And so there's a lot more to come as talks will commence tomorrow when Mr. Xi and Mr. Macron meet.
Well, we'll speak to you guys more then. Thanks so very much, CNA correspondent Tan Si-hui in Beijing, and of course Ross Cullen for CNA in Paris. Well, time now for a short break, but coming up on East Asia tonight, the Chinese services sector still sluggish in November, expanding at its slowest pace in 5 months. And some Japanese firms filing lawsuits to contest U.S. tariffs as they await the findings of the U.S. Supreme Court on the validity of the so-called reciprocal levies. Hello again. You're watching East Asia tonight. And we've got Roland Lim now joining us for the very latest in the business world. And today we're talking about China National Uranium making its trading debut today. How did it go?
Oh, yes. The state-related miner of uranium glowed in its debut on the Shenzhen Stock Exchange as investors drove the price up to dizzying heights from the start of trade. The listing marks a major move in China's race for global uranium resources. The mineral is a cornerstone of President Xi Jinping's national security strategy, with the country expanding its nuclear weapons stockpile. The state-owned giant issued more than 248 million new shares, with close to a third allocated to state-owned enterprises and funds at 17 yuan 89 apiece. Now that netted about $628 million in total. The company plans to channel most of the proceeds into expanding uranium mines in Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang. The company is a key subsidiary of China National Nuclear Corporation. It's the country's largest miner and distributor of national uranium, controlling 19 mines, including 2 in Namibia. Strong sales and rising uranium prices have boosted revenue and profits this year in double digits, and full-year forecasts point to continued growth. The stock ending the trading session in Shenzhen 280% up, in sharp contrast with the benchmark Shenzhen component, which ended in the red by 0.78%. Fresh signs of strain in China's economy. A new private survey shows the country's services sector expanded at its slowest pace in 5 months, underscoring weak consumer demand and rising pressure on overall growth. The rating dog China Services Purchasing Managers Index slipped to 52.1 in November, marking the third consecutive month of decline. Now, while still above 50, which signals expansion, analysts say the momentum is clearly fading. Rating dog found business confidence sinking to near record lows, new orders slowing, and employment continuing to contract despite a slight boost from external demand. The broader services sector, once a rare bright spot amid deflation and weak consumer confidence, is now feeling the impact of slumping housing prices and a soft jobs market. A growing number of companies are headed to court over controversial tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. They are seeking refunds on the additional duties they paid under tariffs the White House introduced without congressional approval. At least 9 Japanese firms, including affiliates of Toyota Seisho, Sumitomo Chemical, and Ricoh, have filed lawsuits against the U.S. government. U.S. President Trump used the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, arguing that emergency authority allowed him to impose new levies, including the so-called reciprocal tariffs. But lower courts ruled those actions exceeded presidential power and were unconstitutional. Now, the Supreme Court is reviewing the case. Businesses are filing suits to ensure they get reimbursed if the justices strike those tariffs down. A ruling could come by the end of the year. An acute global shortage of memory chips is forcing AI and consumer electronics firms into a race to secure dwindling supplies. Tech giants, including Microsoft, Google, and ByteDance, are scrambling to secure supplies from memory chip makers like Micron, Samsung Electronics, and SK Hynix. Inventory levels of dynamic random access memory, or DRAM chips, used mainly in computers and phones have declined sharply over the past year to just a couple of weeks in October. That's hitting makers of consumer electronics, which tend to use lower-end chips. The crunch coming as makers of memory chips shifted to allocate production to higher bandwidth chips to meet surging demand for AI-related products.
Also sounds like we are getting an old school chip shortage because of the AI boom. So what exactly is going on and what does it mean for our gadgets and wallets? Have to put that question to you, Roland. So exactly how severe is the problem and what exactly are the chip makers saying?
Well, it's not good news. I mean, the AI race is basically soaking up all the excess capacity that these chip makers can make. And they're running into the laws of physics, because limited fabrication plants, limited wafers, and everyone from AI hyperscalers to consumer electronics need these chips. So remember, I mean, training these large language models, they need a lot of memory, a lot of high bandwidth memory, or HBM, alongside with the more ordinary DRAM chips, that flash memory chips that are also working beside them in data centers. Chip makers have shifted their focus, as I mentioned in my report earlier, that they're now building the sexier, more lucrative AI chips like the NVIDIA's H20 or Blackwell chips, as opposed to the regular chips boring chips that are found in your phones or your laptop. So you could say that this is actually hurting businesses all around.
So it's not just the data centers, though. I mean, everyday tech impacted as well. So how exposed are consumer electronics?
Well, you could say that the AI boom is now threatening the boom. I mean, SK Hynix, the world's #3 chip maker, is warning that the memory chip shortage could last into late 2027. And guess what? I mean, in October, it announced that all the chips that it's producing, or nearly all of it, it's producing in 2026, already spoken for, sold out. So cloud players like Microsoft, Amazon, ByteDance, and even ChatGPT, they are telling the chip makers that, sell us whatever you got. If you keep supplying, we'll keep buying, mainly to keep their supplies going as well. And recently, e-commerce giant Tencent also warning that because of the chip shortages, that its AI cloud expansion services might be affected. So we're seeing a knockback effect, as it were, that these data centers could actually be slowing down in terms of expansion because of these chip shortages.
So because of that, then what are the companies doing about it, firstly? And both the chip makers and the brands that we buy from, what's happening there? Well,
retail side, Japanese electronics stores are already rationing the flash memory chips or the solid-state disk chips that you can find in stores. We're also seeing prices for popular gaming memory chips in Tokyo also more than doubling in prices. Smartphone makers, Xiaomi, Realme, they're also warning that because of the chip prices rising, that they may also have to increase prices of their handsets. So chip makers, they're pulling all the levers. Samsung has also started to raise prices of their servers by up to 60%. SK Hynix, Micron, they're boosting capacity. I mean, Micron just invested $10 billion in a high bandwidth memory plant in Tokyo. But again, supplies won't start until 2028, so that's a little bit too late for that. So device makers, meantime, are busy stockpiling, and they're also redesigning the new products so that these new products do with less memory. So bottom line is that if you are going to a store and you're buying a laptop or a handphone, well, you're not going to be getting bargains. And at the same time, there might be also a shrinkflation in terms of the memory bandwidth that it has.
Okay, well, I'm going to hold on to mine for a while then. Well, thanks so much for explaining this all to us. Okay, gonna go for another break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight. South Korea marks 1 year since a short-lived martial law decree plunged the country into crisis. But a deep political divide remains, with the president vowing to make national unity his priority. And I'll be speaking with Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo from King's College, London, on the challenges ahead for Mr. Lee Jae Myung. And residents allowed to return home briefly to pick up their belongings 1 week after Hong Kong's worst fire in decades. This is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines you're following. French President Emmanuel Macron has arrived in Beijing for a 3-day state visit, as Europe seeks to balance ties with China on the economic and security front. He's scheduled to meet Chinese counterpart President Xi Jinping tomorrow. Well, meantime, the death toll from Hong Kong's Typo inferno rises to 159, sparking even more fury and louder calls for a tougher probe and accountability. One unaffected block reopened briefly so residents could grab essential items. And South Korean President Lee Jae Myung hails citizens for overcoming chaos and turmoil as the country marks the first anniversary of its very brief martial law period. But he admits more work remains to address the fallout of the attempted martial law. And for more insights, let's bring in Ramon Pacheco Pardo, Professor of International Relations at King's College, London. Well, thanks, Professor, for joining us this evening. First, let's just look under the hood of South Korea's chain of command. What exactly do you think, has been fixed since last December to make sure that this repeat doesn't happen again?
Well, I think first of all, we have seen how the Korean people reacted to the martial law declaration and its aftermath, which I think makes it unthinkable for any South Korean politician to try a similar approach to domestic politics in the future with another martial law declaration. And I think we have also seen how the National Assembly of South Korea has been strengthened, because it was the National Assembly that actually stopped the coup on its tracks, or the martial law declaration on its tracks. And I think it has shown that it can exercise its power to prevent any future Korean president from taking a similar step.
So if we talk about zooming in on the domestic politics and the opposition calculus, Mr. Yu now being on trial, the conservative camp, though, I mean, how do you see it? Are they consolidating? Are they fracturing? And what does that split mean for the next electoral cycle?
I think there has been a fracture in the now opposition camp, but it has to be said that today many lawmakers and some of the leaders of the party have apologized for the decision that the former President Yoon took exactly 1 year ago. And what we have seen in recent weeks is that there has been a very open debate really in the Conservative Party. And I think those who believe that they should move on, apologize, and try to focus on the livelihood of the South Korean people rather than discussing whether the martial law declaration should have taken place or not, seem to have the upper hand. And we saw actually yesterday that the opposition party sided with the ruling party to, for the first time in 5 years, to approve the new South Korean budget for next year on time. So it seems that they're focusing more on governing and the livelihood of the people, and not so much on discussing what happened 1 year ago and what has happened since then.
And speaking of apology, I mean, it's interesting to note, right, that President Lee, he floated the idea of an apology to North Korea, while warning that it could be weaponized. What signal is the president trying to send here to the North and as well as to his own voters?
I think he has his own North Korea policy, as we know. He's trying to rapprochement with North Korea. And it is true that as part of the martial law declaration and its aftermath and the cases we're seeing now going on trial, it seems that at some point former President Yoon thought about provoking North Korea into an attack on the South. This has not been proved, but it's part of the accusations against the president. And I think President Lee Jae Myung, the current President Lee Jae Myung, he's trying to show to North Korea that he wants to take a different path, and his intention is not to try to provoke a confrontation between the two Koreas.
The external squeeze between the two neighbors and top trading partners, I want to highlight here that President Lee, he also said that he's not taking sides when it comes to the Japan-China row. But what if it hits Korean interests? I'm saying like be it export curbs or it's a exclusive economic zone run-ins. He's trying to stay neutral here, but how realistic is that? And where do you think are some of Seoul's red lines?
Well, I think there is a difference between the rhetoric coming out from President Lee Jae Myung, but then there's the reality of the actions he has taken. Clearly, he's siding more closely with the United States and also with Japan. We shouldn't forget that his first foreign trip was actually to Tokyo on his way to Washington, a state visit. So what we see is that the rhetoric is that he doesn't want to take sides. He wants to have a good relationship with China. But in practice, I think that we see how he's trying to improve relations with Japan, including economic relations, because now Korean companies are increasingly competing against Chinese companies in many different sectors, such as semiconductors, for example, robotics as well. And many Korean companies are trying to work more closely with Japanese companies, which are key suppliers of Korean companies, for example, in the semiconductor sector. And I think this is a priority not only for the president, but many Korean business people have made clear that they see the future of their economy in having a stronger relationship with Japan and also with other countries such as the US, Europe, or Australia, for example, not only in terms of security, but also in terms of economics.
So in other words, you don't think last year's martial law decree scare actually dented Korea's reputation with investors in any way?
I think they did because the response was very quick. So National Assembly immediately voted against the declaration. It had to be rescinded within 6 hours by the former President Yoon himself. And we saw that the Korean people very clearly sided with those who opposed the declaration by a margin of around 80% against 20% who were ambivalent about the martial law declaration. And I think that has reassured investors. I think it has also helped that we have seen the judicial process proceeding peacefully. There was an election that was also peaceful. The opposition party accepted the result of the election. And I think this has been reassuring for investors. And I think the thing that we have seen as well is that the Korean economy is interestingly benefiting, it seems, from this US-China turmoil. Is going to have record exports this year. It's getting closer to the US, to Europe, to Japan, as I mentioned previously. So the hit of weakening economic ties with China is not as big as it would have been in the past because of the ties that the South Korean economy is building with other key markets. And this obviously includes Southeast Asia as well.
So, Professor, just looking ahead here, President Lee, he's talked about unity, he's talked about putting justice first. What should we be looking out in the next 6 to 12 months to see that, they're on track to doing just that?
I think we'll see the process in the tribunals continuing over the next few months. It has to be said that both the ruling party but also the opposition party are being very respectful of the judiciary throughout this whole process. And I think this is reassuring to the Korean people, but also to investors that we're discussing before. And I think that the opposition party, the PPP, I think is moving towards acknowledging what happened, apologizing as it did today about what happened a year ago, and trying to focus on the livelihood of the South Korean people, which is what the electorate wants to see, because they also want a strong opposition. They not only want the ruling party to be able to take any decisions over the next 3, 4, 5 years. They want the opposition party to be able to provide an alternative. And we're going to have obviously local elections, National Assembly elections before the next presidential election in 4 years and a half time. And I think we're going to see a stronger opposition party. So we're going to see a return to politics more or less as usual, right? With the competition that you see between the ruling and the opposition party, and also the minor parties, of course, being able to have a say in the political process in South Korea.
All right, we look watching this space over the next 6 to 12 months for the real verdict. Well, thank you so very much for your time and thoughts, Ramon Pacheco Pardo, Professor of International Relations at King's College London. Well, in other news, public anger and frustration mounting over Hong Kong's deadly blaze in Tai Po district, which killed at least 159 and left thousands without homes. Residents and mourners have been demanding that the government ramp up its probe into what caused the fire and hold all responsible accountable. Well, around 30 people remain unaccounted for after all 7 fire-ravaged buildings have been searched. One of the blocks that was not directly affected by the blaze has been opened to residents to allow them to collect their belongings. More than 2,600 of them have been temporarily rehoused.
心好攰咯，即心力交瘁。希望依家執完嘢係過到屋定到落。
I think there's no negotiation, justice, and really justice for the victims. And I think the entire population in Hong Kong would love to have the truth and the justice to be told.
Police have set up hotlines for people to submit photos and videos that might help shed light into what happened. An independent review committee led by a judge will probe the cause of the city's worst fire in 7 decades. An official says investigations will take 6 to 9 months. Half a dozen fire equipment contractors have been arrested, putting the total number of people detained to 21. Authorities, meantime, are moving ahead with a legislative election on Sunday, a move analysts call a test of legitimacy for the Hong Kong government. Chief Executive John Lee says that elections will allow newly elected legislators to speed up support for post-disaster reconstruction and reforms. Election forums have since resumed after a brief suspension after the fire, though political campaigning remains paused. And we'll have extensive coverage of this story across CNA platforms on our website, cna.asia, on CNA 938 Radio, and also on our mobile app. Plus, you can always find us on Facebook and YouTube. A senior Taiwan security official said that the Chinese military has staged what it describes as mock attacks on foreign warships sailing in the Taiwan Strait. A senior official described those attempts, noting China would shadow foreign ships when they are passing the contested waters, and that Beijing would sometimes mobilize its air force and, quote, demonstrate military presence and claim authority in the Taiwan Strait. Navies from 8 countries, including the UK, France, and the US, have made a dozen sailings through the strait so far this year. Mr. Tai said that Taipei would share intelligence with international partners when they are operating in the waters. Beijing routinely denounces such sailings as a provocation, as it maintains that it alone exercises sovereignty and jurisdiction over the Taiwan Strait. But both Washington and Taipei say that the strait is an international waterway open to all vessels. Well, coming up on East Asia tonight, we'll find out what makes this city one of China's happiest for 16 years straight. Hello there, glad you're still with us on East Asia tonight. Got something to share with you, and that is forget grand old Beijing, cosmopolitan Shanghai, and even ultra-modern Shenzhen. Now, they may be the most famous of Chinese cities, but when it comes to the happiest one, you wouldn't be too far off if you looked in the southwestern corner of the Middle Kingdom, in Sichuan province to be exact. Now, its capital, Chengdu, has been named one of China's happiest cities year after year. And CNA's Melody Chan visited the city to find out if it lives up to its reputation.
While other big cities race ahead in tech, finance, and education, Chengdu has a different kind of reputation. It has been named one of the happiest cities in China for 16 years in a row. And if you ask the locals for the secret to Chengdu's high quality of life, they'll tell you this: spicy hot pot, a game of mahjong, and tea.
首先民以食为天，那是肯定的吃，我是比较喜欢吃。
In contrast to other megacities like Beijing and Shenzhen, known for cutthroat and hyper-competitive work cultures, observers say Chengdu seems to appreciate the simpler things in life. Locals can often be found relaxing at public parks, and there are more than 1,500 across the city.
直播成都人呢，天性的有一种惰性，就是什么事情，哪怕是火烧房了，都不觉得好着急那个样，那该烧就烧嘛，烧完就完了嘛。
But being laid back hasn't stopped Chengdu from keeping pace with other cities. More than 2/3 of the local economy is made up of services, from tourism and dining to creative sectors and esports. From 2010 to 2020, its GDP ranking in the country climbed from 13th to 7th, a position it still holds today. Chengdu's reputation has attracted its fair share of admirers from other parts of China. Last year, the city's population grew by 0.3%, about 71,000 new residents, bucking the nationwide trend of population decline.
成都是能容纳一切地方的人，它也能容纳一切的风情，就类似于一个大妈会指着你的装扮说：“哇，你好帅呀，你好漂亮啊，可以拍张照吗？”
But that rapid rise has also brought new pressures. Beneath the city's relaxed vibe, some residents, especially the younger generation, are feeling the heat.
以前开发商其实他建的房子基本上都是这种刚需房，就是瞄准的就是这种年轻的群体嘛，对吧？但其实现在就是房价涨到了一个阶段了，对于虽然说对比如说北京上海还算便宜，但是其实就收入来讲，平衡收入来讲，年轻人还是会觉得越来越高，可能支付不了了，所以觉得买房无望了。
但是这没办法啊，当你逃脱不了这个地方的时候，你就只有好好的做自己的事儿。但是对于从外地过来工作的朋友，据我了解是压力非常大的。
Some locals say outsiders often overly romanticize Chengdu's lifestyle.
如果是打麻将就幸福了的话，那么这幸福也太简单了。结果任何人都可以打的，哪怕身上一分钱都没得，他都可以打2把麻将，那是你能说他就幸福了？
很多时候会听到客人会跟你说，就是觉得很羡慕你这样的生活，开了一个书店，然后每天就守店，过这种平淡幸福的日子，他们觉得很舒服。但其实就我们自己知道，这样的日子还是有点怎么说，有点恼火。因为第一个是收入的问题，这家店其实每个月亏个6000块钱左右，全靠老板养着。
But perhaps in true Chengdu style, the locals have a way of coping with problems.
能在这里认识很多朋友，包括和以前的朋友一起，大家聚在这儿玩，然后每天喝酒、聊聊天什么的，我觉得这样挺开心的。
In Chengdu, there's a saying in Chinese, there's no problem a hot pot can fix. If there is, another will do.
And maybe that's the real secret behind Chengdu's happiness, finding small morsels of joy to balance out the pressures of everyday life.
All right, so let's find out more. Let's bring in Melody Chan joining us live now from our Shenzhen bureau. So, Mel, I have to say I felt pretty relaxed as well, watching that report of yours. But why is it that people in Chengdu are generally more laid back?
Right. So actually there is a saying locally to describe this entire wave of life. It's called 80, and it means comfortable, laid back, relaxed. And, over time, this has become a kind of philosophy or a kind of mindset that people live by. And to understand why, we actually have to look at the history and geography of Chengdu. So Chengdu sits in this basin surrounded by mountains. So for centuries, it's been a place that is hard to attack and easy to defend. So there is relatively more stability there. And when people live in stability for a long period of time, they tend to slow down, be able to live by the moment or enjoy life. And also, Chengdu has a long cultural tradition. So a lot of China's most popular poets like Li Bai, Su Shi, Du Fu, they have been to Chengdu. And just in the Tang Dynasty alone, there have been more than 180 of poets visited Sichuan. And they painted Chengdu into a very peaceful and poetic place because they were drawn by the lifestyle and scenery there. And that kind of image helped people imagine the city even till today. So when you speak to the people on ground, you can actually sense that the sense of ease has been passed down for generations. It's almost like part of their DNA.
Oh, that's amazing. So you are basically a Singaporean, but you're also a Shenzhen resident. And of course, having traveled across all these different Chinese cities, tell us what struck you the most about Chengdu?
Right. So this is actually not the first time I'm in Chengdu. I was there a couple months ago. As for my holiday, I went to hike in the nearby West Sichuan region. And so it's, I think it's very easy to find out why people across China or even overseas are drawn to Chengdu, because Chengdu is like this hub, and it's very easily accessible to a lot of those famous attractions like the Emei Mountain, the West Sichuan region, the Dujiangyan. And it's also a place that is very welcoming for foreigners. And for you to reach to that kind of a high altitude landscape, and we are talking about mountains that go up to more than 5,000 meters, is not everywhere in China that can find a place like that. And besides that, Chengdu is also very affordable. We realize that the prices there is actually around 15 to 20% lesser than in Beijing, Shanghai, and other cities like that. Right. Another thing that struck me a lot, is that the city is also very into sports scene. So we went to this Tianfu Green Lane, which is like a 100-meter circular trail around, so that you can walk, run, or cycle. And we see a lot of locals there. And it's also like the first park city in China. So very easy for people to access the nature. So that kind of vibe actually helps to bring people, give them the space to escape the kind of everyday busy or rat race that you have in a lot of the bigger cities in China. So if you add all those together, it's quite easy to find out why people there find life a little bit easier.
And not to mention that Chengdu is also the panda capital of the world. So, well, thanks so much. I got to plan my next visit there sometime soon. Thanks, Melody. CNA's correspondent, Melody Chen in Shenzhen. On that note, it is time to wrap up Wednesday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cne.asia. And find us on Facebook and YouTube as well. Thanks for watching.